when you are now you're within the reach of wealth and profit, you forget about humanity. So I think our lecture today on this is a politics that thinks humanity. Without thinking humanity, we cannot transcend to that level of excessive politics, a politics without place, a politics without identity. So thank you.
Yeah, that's politics. That's political science in the verse. You see, Prof, we're well cooked here. We're cooking every day in the kitchen. There's a corridor there in building 11. We always cook there every morning. There's breakfast of ideas there. So, this is what we are going to do, ladies and gentlemen. I hope you have noted your questions. You have noted your inputs. I hope so. So what I'm going to do is, I want to test this theory, Prof, of whether people can drive themselves in an orderly manner without being guided. I'm going to ask, we take a little break of 10 minutes, and this is how we are going to do it. We'll take snacks, and we'll go through the rows, and then we sit down, and then we allow Professor Crane to come on the podium and give us a talk, right? So that is politics of emancipation. But before we do that, I will allow our visitors, our seniors to go first, and then we can start in that row, and then we are able to move. That is a test. I'm testing this theory. I just want to see, and Prof. Neocosmos must also be able to see if what he's theorizing is working. You can hold your pen and eat with one hand. You have got two. So we'll listen to Prof. He'll be taking us through the Cape Radicals, the hidden history of the New Era Fellowship, how intellectuals kind of made the intervention Sesman spoke about in Cape Town to inform the style of emancipatory politics that you can imagine in Cape Town, and how that transcended over Cape Town to the entire republic. So, Prof, the mic is yours.
Okay. Thanks very much, Frank. Thanks for asking me to come here and talk about this work. So I've been talking about this work quite a lot over the last year or so. But curiously, the talk has always been to people who know a lot about this history. And so when you asked me to come and speak, I said, now, how much would people actually know about this part of the world where all of this comes from, which in some ways is quite remote from the political traditions of this part of the world. But then I thought that actually what Frank was doing was assisting in what the purpose of this whole project was. The purpose of this whole project, talking about the New Era Fellowship, is to try and engage with South African historiography. I mean, that's the purpose of this exercise, to try and begin a conversation about our history, which isn't written from the perspective of dominance. And I'm talking about dominance in its widest sense here now, including talking about political dominance. So there's a really important message that I would like to be coming out here to talk about a period in the history of South African political thought which is absolutely extraordinary and which has significance for all of us. It ties in a lot with what Michael was talking about. It's an illustration in some ways of what Michael was talking about. The point that I want to leave with you is that we have in the story of the New Era Fellowship a response to global politics which is deeply, deeply profound. And the fact that it comes out of the 1930s makes it even more profound. So here's a story about, and I want to say to you, it's a story about all of us. It's a story about the political and intellectual developments that emerge out of the complexity of South Africa, which all of us ought to know about. And this is the intent, if you like, in trying to say that there's a hidden history here which is really crucial for us to be thinking about. So I'm going to show you some pictures as I'm going along in this talk here, and these pictures are intended to give you some sense of what this complexity is all about. So Keith Breckenridge wrote a really important book in 2014. That book is called The Biometric State. How many of you have heard of that book? The Biometric State. Let's see, put your hands up. Okay, it's really crucial that you come to learn about this book. Because what the biometric state does is make the point that South Africa is a pivotal place in the global politics around racial domination. Okay? Because he tries to show how it is here in South Africa that some of the world's major theories about race and how race works were worked out here. And a key person in all of that is a man called Francis Galton. Now, Francis Galton was the nephew, the cousin of Charles Darwin. And around about 1860, this man Galton comes here to South Africa, and he undertakes a kind of ethnographic tour of Southern Africa, and he spends a lot of time amongst the Herero in what is today called modern Namibia. And the purpose of his work is essentially to describe the native peoples. This is what his purpose is. And in doing so, he comes to the conclusion that these people physically and biologically are inferior to white people. This is the first time globally that you have scientific work undertaken to make this point about what race is all about. And the whole eugenics movement comes out of this work. You know what eugenics is, right? Yes or no? Okay, so this is a class, eh? So eugenics is essentially that philosophy about improving the human race, which is at the heart of what the Second World War is all about. It takes expression particularly in this idea of the world being divided into these racial hierarchies with people called Caucasians. A word which some of us think is a nice word. It's a terrible word. It comes from this theory that the world is divided into Caucasians, Mongoloids, and Negroids. And these three great racial groups are what the human race is all about. And with eugenics, you come to a particular point where the belief is propagated that the human race reaches its apex, reaches its climax in the form of North Europeans. Not Southern Europeans, North Europeans. Blonde, tall, athletic, these absolutely healthy human beings which the Nazis thought were what all human beings should ultimately become and be like. And it's on that basis that they decided that inferior peoples should be eliminated and wiped out. And they then go after the Jews. The Jews are their target, and 6 million people get wiped out. But it's not only Jews who get wiped out. It's anybody in that particular time period who demonstrates any kind of human weakness. So what eugenics does is encourage a culture during the 1930s and the 1940s of people who are supposedly, who are thought of as being retarded, should be eliminated, should be removed from the gene pool in which human beings find themselves. Now, the person who starts this idea is this man Galton, and he comes to do it here in South Africa. So South Africa we regard as a laboratory for thinking about how this racial idea comes to take shape and expands elsewhere in the world. So in response, what I'm arguing here with this book is that we also have in South Africa, this laboratory of South Africa, we have the world's first major response to this idea of eugenics. And this idea is propagated, it comes out of Cape Town in the 1930s. So in the 1930s, you have the political idea, largely the one around a person is a person, being expressed in political terms as a political philosophy anywhere for the first time in the world here. It happens here in South Africa. This is our contribution to global civilization, if you like. It's a contribution which begins with absolutely extraordinary people. The photograph that I have here is of a woman called Dora Taylor. She was an English literary scholar who was a member of the New Era Fellowship that I'll describe to you in a minute. And this woman makes the point that you have in Cape Town in the 1930s an absolute intellectual hothouse which is emerging, which comes to produce the most incredible thinking that you have anywhere in the world at the time. And leading that particular process is a whole array of people, and one of them is a man called I.B. Tabata. You've heard of I.B. Tabata. Okay, this is a class. So this man is and writes, and he's a contemporary of Mr. Mandela. He is around exactly, he's a little older than Mr. Mandela. Now, that you don't know about him is what this tragedy of this historiography is all about. Because this man writes these incredible books in the 1950s. One of them is called The Awakening of the People. And another one is called Education for Barbarism. And these two texts are extraordinary. And the fact that we know so little about all of this is to our utter detriment. But the amazing thing about Tabata is that Tabata is a dropout from Fort Hare University, right? Second year, gets into second year at Fort Hare University and decides that he's going to join the Lorry Drivers Union in Cape Town in the early 1930s. And when he gets there, he finds this community of absolutely amazing people. This community essentially assembles at a hostel. A hostel which is intended to provide, if you like, short-term accommodation for people coming in and out of Cape Town. Now, this place here is called the Stakesby Lewis Hostel. It still exists. It's in District 6. And at the Stakesby Lewis hostel, this man, I.B. Tabata, came to stay for short periods of time. But there, he came into contact with people like this. No, sorry, not this woman. So this woman is Olive Schreiner. You've heard of Olive Schreiner, eh? You're in a class. South Africa is an incredible country. This woman, Olive Schreiner, writes this first big novel in South African history. It's called the Story of an African Farm. Okay? You folks must get on top of all of this stuff. Michael was fixing you up early on for coming and walking in and out. I'm going to fix you up for not reading. And so the big task that you have here is to read until your eyeballs fall out. So this woman writes this book, The Story of an African Farm, and she's this great, great liberal. She's a liberal of the 1880s, and she is the sister of one of the first prime ministers of the Cape. But the amazing thing about this woman is that she knew what was going on in the world. She knew about the Haitian Revolution. And she absorbed all of this stuff about the Haitian Revolution. And so what this woman does, one of the most amazing things, she writes a text in response to Marx. And she criticizes Marx. She tells Marx, And it's essentially, she takes up this question of women to say that you don't understand the gender struggle. And one of the most extraordinary things that she does in that is to talk, and it's one of the first, if you like, intellectuals anywhere in the world to say this, is to say that this binary divide between male and female is an artificial one. It's a made-up construction of identity which all of us have succumbed to and have adopted. And here's this woman, this liberal, this Cape liberal woman, talking about this and writing these texts in around about 1904. She also comes to this insight that race is a made-up idea too, but she doesn't articulate it in the same kind of way as she is able to with the story of gender. But she has immense influence, and so there are a small group of people around her who are listening and watching and very attentive to what this woman does. And one of them is a refugee from the pogroms in Russia, Lithuania, and so on. And her name is Schlechter. I forget her first name. And this woman becomes, if you like, this after Olive Schreiner dies around about 1919. This woman takes on this mantle, this responsibility of keeping alive Olive Schreiner's ideas. And the way in which she does that is by keeping open house. She lived in an area of Cape Town which would today probably be where Rondebosch is. And she brought to this house intellectuals every week on an open house basis. And to her house came two really critical intellectuals. One of them is a man called Jim Farrington, and the other one was a man called Lancelot Hogben. And they were both lecturers at the University of Cape Town at the time. Farrington was a member of the Irish rebellion, and he comes to Cape Town and he's full of these ideas of the struggle for independence. Ireland is a colony of Britain, right? And he's able to instill in people's minds this idea of the importance of understanding and joining the anti-colonial struggle, including the struggle for independence of this country in Europe. I mean, just get your head around this complexity, right? But he's joined by this other man, Lancelot Hogben. Now, Lancelot Hogben is absolutely critical for all of us to know. Lancelot Hogben was a social biologist. And he goes to get into trouble at UCT because he begins to tell all of these professors at UCT who've been collecting skulls as part of this Galton project, which this eugenics project, and it's a story that these universities of Cape Town and Wits in particular must still come to actually account for. Because what these intellectuals at these universities were doing were collecting these skulls behind this project to show that black brains were smaller than white brains, right? And so to this day, we still have in anatomy departments at those universities skulls in drawers in people's offices, which come out of that particular story. And here was Lancelot Hogben, and Hogben was trying to tell these people that what you are doing is bad science. It's bad science. Because you cannot prove, and you haven't been able to prove at all, with all of these studies of craniometry, study of the human brain, that black brains are smaller than white brains. And he begins to, as a social biologist, tell the story that there is no difference between black and white people, right? So this is at UCT in 1929. He gets into such trouble at UCT that he has to leave. And he goes to the University of London, where he sets up the first department of social biology anywhere in the world. But he has, at these weekly meetings that took place at the Schlichterhaus, met people like Tabata. So people like Tabata come to meet Hogben, they come to meet Farringdon, they come to meet Schlichter, who are these inheritors of this white woman, let me say, Schreiner, who are beginning to talk about new ways of understanding what we human beings are all about. And they are deeply, deeply influenced. So Tabata and a man, and I'll show you, these people's pictures. Ghulam Gul, there he is. And this man, Ghulam Gul, Tabata, Ghulam Gul. Sorry, I'm looking at the. So in this, it's showing me two pictures, and I'm looking at the wrong pictures. So this here's Ghulam Gul, and this Ghulam Gul was an absolutely precocious man. He was born as a Muslim and was raised as a Muslim, but he gets to this particular point where he's able to understand how important it is to exceed this history, out of which he comes. He's very influenced, as I say, by Hogben and these people. And these people are in a conversation with each other as socialists during this particular time, when there are these major struggles going on in global socialism. There's a major struggle going on in global socialism at that time between the Stalinists and the Trotskyists. Right? Stalin had, after he had taken over from Lenin, at that particular time, had begun to go after Trotsky, because Trotsky was a rival, and Trotsky had to escape from the Soviet Union and lands up in a whole variety of places, and finally, of course, lands up in Mexico in the early 1940s, where he's assassinated. He's assassinated by Stalin's secret agents. But there's this debate going on in the world about what socialism is all about. And that debate is very much alive in these intellectual circles in Cape Town at that time. And the debate at that particular point is given a South African expression, which is something that I hope that you would know about. Coming out of that particular debate is the thesis of the Black Republic, okay, which is the position which the South African Communist Party takes about how the South African struggle ought to be prosecuted. And the key principles of that particular debate is this question of race. And the theory essentially is divided into a theory of two phases, that what South Africa needs to undergo, first of all, is a democratic revolution, which is a revolution which will sort out the race problem. And once the race problem has been sorted out, the country can go on and then sort out the class problem. Right? Two stages. So these people, Tabata and people like Ghulam Gul, are hearing this debate. And they take a Trotsky position in relation to that debate. And their position is essentially that there's only one struggle. And that struggle is for complete liberation, and it doesn't go in phases. And they come and they depend in that particular argument on Trotsky's thesis of what is called the permanent revolution. That the revolution is on the go all the time. Now, it's out of that particular debate that sociology in South Africa comes to its absolute apex in terms of what analysis, what understanding it is giving to the world around this question of race. And I'll come to that. But the point that I want to make to you is that in that moment is born social theory, which the world only really comes to an awareness of, a sense of 30 years later. The theory comes to its beginnings right here. And there's a whole series of political movements that are born during this particular time. One of them is called the National Liberation League. And the National Liberation League is an attempt to bring together communists and socialists from a whole variety of positions around a united front. And the idea of the united front is very active in that particular period. A major figure in that figure was a man called John Gomez, who was a member of the ANC, and he was a political sparrer with Ghulam Gul, and together Ghulam Gul as a member of the Trotskyists, and Johnny Gomez as a member of the ANC, come together to form this united front. And it's in this conversation that they start asking the question about how should we understand the sociological nature of what South Africa is all about. And Gomez tends to go with the South African Communist Party, which essentially puts the idea that race is the premier factor which needs to be taken into consideration. And Ghulam Gul takes the position that it's class. But the idea is not at this particular point at all one which is clear in anybody's heads. So you can imagine what South Africa was like at that particular time, right? South Africa as this colonial space in which, and it's important for us to understand this, in which the country was moving from segregation to apartheid. So this is the period in which, if you like, you have the rise and the emergence and movement to prominence of formalized Afrikaans politics. So Afrikaans politics is still very much in maneuver coming into this particular period. But from about the early 1930s, Afrikaans politics comes into its own in incredible kinds of ways. You have Afrikaans intellectuals coming back from Europe, coming into the universities, coming into political movements, and beginning to contribute to a set of thinking within the Afrikaans community about the nature of life, the nature of human beings. And a key figure in that particular period, and again, I'm going to treat this as a class, is a man called Geoffrey Cronje. I'm going to ask Professor Krokamp if he knows Geoffrey Cronje. Pardon?
Not as well as you.
So this man, Geoffrey Cronje, is the sociologist who comes to the University of Pretoria and is responsible in that period that he is there at the University of Pretoria from about the middle of the 1930s till into the 70s, is responsible for the establishment of the Department of Sociology, the Department of Social Work, later on the Drama Department, and the Department of Criminology. He's also responsible for the establishment of the HSRC. So he's an incredible intellectual, and he writes these amazing books from about the late 1930s into the 1940s. And he's the key intellectual behind Verwoerd. When Verwoerd comes to develop these principles around apartheid, he is depending on this man, Geoffrey Cronje. So Geoffrey Cronje writes these key texts in 1944, 1945, 1947, and these key texts spell out what the blueprint of apartheid should be all about. And you see in these texts the laying out of what the racial nature of South Africa is all about. You know, he lays out what the social structure of South Africa consists of. You know, he talks about what the responsibility of white people might be, what the responsibility of white people in relation to people who are called natives at that particular point, and he describes what natives are in their character and in their civilizational development, and it's an amazing, if you like, analysis of what the country is and how the country comes to be understood. And it's that sociology that gets taught then in sociology departments almost throughout the country. The kind of sociology that comes to be dominant is essentially built around the contribution that this man makes. But the interesting thing about the man is that he's an existentialist. He's a phenomenologist. He comes from the height of what this phenomenology, which is current in Europe at that particular time. You know, so phenomenology is this new way of thinking about human consciousness and subjectivity, which is bubbling in Europe at that particular point, where Europe is thinking about what humans are all about. And it's absolutely extraordinary philosophy. You know, it's extraordinary philosophy which comes way out of this Enlightenment period and begins to come to grips with thinking about the complexity of what human beings are all about. This man brings back this existentialism here, and he talks about, and he writes this amazing book. He writes this amazing book about human beings. And when you read that book, you'd think you'd be talking to and thinking about the most progressive philosophers that are alive at that particular point. And you go through the whole book. And I read the book, and it's in Afrikaans. I'll not just say this to Professor. I could read that Afrikaans. You know, I could make sense of it. But you get to the end of the book, and it hits you like a ton of bricks. That what this man is actually thinking, when he's talking about this incredible nature of human beings, he's talking about white people. Right? Black people don't count in that understanding of what human capacity, human potential is all about. Absolutely amazing. So this is the architect of apartheid. As this architect is doing this, and we're now moving into the 1940s, as Afrikaner political thought is gripped with this mentality, with this ideology, it's gripped with it. Right? And you see how the universities, for example, begin to take form around this ideology, particularly universities like the University of Pretoria, the University of Stellenbosch, and the Potchefstroom University. Yeah. It is bubbling and frothing at the mouth here around these kinds of ideas. So here you've got these very advanced European ideas that are brought here, but then come to be applied in this deeply, deeply classificatory way, which takes this whole project of eugenics to another level. Right? It takes this whole thing about what counts as proper and fit human beings to a completely another level. So this is what is going on. This is now the moment in which apartheid comes into its absolute clarity about how this country ought to be governed. And this expression, which you see then in Bantu education, with particularly the Iceland Commission in 1949, which comes to the conclusion that it's going to take 1,000 years for African people to reach this stage, this level of civilization of where white people are. Right? It's going to take 1,000 years. So this is where the country is. Now the amazing thing, of course, is that the rest of the world is gripped in also this way of thinking about what human beings are all about. The rest of the world. The rest of the world is entranced, and it's essentially about the defense of the colonial project. This idea of race is essential to colonialism. Colonialism is unable to justify itself outside of these racial ideas, these ideas of eugenics. So the point that I want to leave with you is that as these ideas are bubbling and taking form here in South Africa in this particular way, you have in Cape Town a small group of people, and they're small. They're just a handful of people. They no more than, at that particular point, a few hundred. It's not a mass movement. But you have these intellectuals beginning to think against this imperial project. And they're beginning to think against this imperial project in absolutely incredible ways. And they discover that the imperial project is dependent on this theory of race. And they begin then, and it's a process which unfolds over a period of about 20 years. It begins with these debates with this institution, with this New Era Fellowship. The New Era Fellowship comes together as an organization which makes the decision that it is going to discuss anything under the sun, and it says that. It establishes itself as a cultural club outside of the University of Cape Town, as a cultural club which will make its responsibility this task of educating people around big questions of the day. And they start off like any cultural club. They do discuss anything under the sun. But gradually, they are coming to have to deal with this political project of dominance. And they begin to read absolutely widely. They find texts. They're beginning to see what the world's major biologists, scientists are saying about human beings. And they find these texts, and these texts are texts written by people like Huxley, a guy called Huxley, who comes out of a line of racists also. But this man, Huxley himself, in the 1930s and the 1940s, begins to shift a little bit and modify his language. And so they read people like Huxley. They read people like the Leakeys and the Goulds, I'll come to the Goulds a little later on, who are doing field work in East Africa around human origins. And they absolutely absorb all of this. And they quickly come to the conclusion, over a period of time, from about 1944 onwards, they come to the conclusion and they make a statement in 1953 that this whole ideology of race is absolute nonsense. And it's an expression which is articulated in clear, powerful scientific terms. So the man who is in the lead of all of that is very influenced by this Ghulam Gul, okay? And his name is Ben Kiss. It's this man. This man was a young student at the University of Cape Town. And when he is 29, he's one of the major figures behind the establishment of this thing called the New Era Fellowship. He's only 29. But in a period of about 20 years, from about 1939 to about 1953, and you can see now he's in his early 40s, he begins to write some of the most advanced analyses of what, if you like, psychoanalysis, social analysis is all about anywhere in the world at that time. His major contribution is to give a lecture in 1953, which is called The Contribution of the Non-European Peoples to Civilization. And in that lecture, and I'll read you just little bits of it. In that lecture, he says, and he's now talking about how this dominant ideology of Western civilization works. He says, and he's very aware of what had happened during the Second World War with the Holocaust and so on. And he's talking about racial biology. He says that the creed of the new myth requires the changing of only one word in the Nordic gospel, and it reads, in Western kind. This is what to backward or child races, whose inherent inferiority is patent from their numbness, skin color, queer customs, heathen gods, laziness, treachery, primitive methods of farming, irresponsibility, fatalism, and disregard for the sacredness of human life. And he says, he's not saying this in 1953, one of our most important tasks of our time is to dissect this myth and to give our reply to it on the level of ideas and in the field of practice. On the level of ideas and in the field of practice. So he begins by emphasizing that all of these racial terms, any term that one should be or could be using, when one describes people as Africans or Europeans, he says that those are only geographical terms. They are no more than that. And that those terms could refer to anybody of any skin color, height, hair, texture, skull, or nose shape who live outside the continent of Europe. So the point that I'm trying to make to you here is that we have in the statement that this man is making a moment in our country's intellectual history which is equal to and in some ways more important than Biko's position around blackness. Very provocative, I'm going to say that. Because you have in this analysis here ontology and epistemology brought into a single ideology. He's talking about what it means to be human, what it means to be a person of full dignity. He goes on to say, it is sufficient for our purpose to say that we, the so-called children of Ham, together with Mrs. D.F. Milan, who becomes the Prime Minister, and Eric Lowe derive from the same stock, Homo sapiens. As Dr. Leakey and the Mau Mau, whom he's now so bitterly fighting. The human race is now, as it was when Homo sapiens evolved, one biological species with the same number and formation of bones, the same brain and nerve structure, the same internal organs, the same 4 types of blood groups, and the same capacity, in fact propensity, for interbreeding. Geographical dispersal, isolation, and diet have not made the slightest difference to the biological unity of man as a single species and provides no scientific basis for division into what are most popularly called races.
Yeah.
1953. So you haven't had yet, at that particular time, the stuff that you folks now hopefully are learning in sociology in 2019. The stuff that you are now learning in sociology in 2019 only began to appear in our teaching around about 1980, late 1980s. The stuff that you're now learning about anthropology, when I was doing anthropology and sociology in the 1970s, that's how long ago it is, the textbooks were still full of that eugenic stuff. They were still about the races of Africa with photographs of people with large posteriors and, pictures of what, people's jaws and skulls were all about. And it is only going into the late 1970s and the 1980s as a result of the revolutions that take place in Europe in the 1960s, which lead to new theory, new sociological theory in the 1970s, that all of this is turned over. And it only becomes a principle of sociology in the 1980s that race is a made-up idea, that race is a social construction, right? That race is an artifact. And it's from that point onwards that this is now what is the dominant thinking in the disciplines, for the social sciences. But the point that I want to just leave with you, and I'm going to close on this here, is that these people were talking about this in the 1950s, and they tried to live it. They tried to live beyond the racial labels and the racial classifications that they were given. So Tabata, Ghulam Gul, Dora Taylor that I showed you, all of them decide that they are not going to work with these ideas of white, black, colored, Indian, African, and so on. They're not going to work with those things. And this is the point that I'd like to use as the lesson in some ways, Frank, for a class like this. They come up with this particular way of talking and thinking and being. And they live in and amongst each other with absolutely no reference to those labels which are accompanying them, which they can't escape all the time. So Tabata regularly gets talked about as this Xhosa man from the Transkei. Regularly, still to this day. He's remembered like that. But he didn't want to be understood like that. This man, Ben Kiss, was offended if you called him a colored. He was outraged and he didn't want to be a colored. And they try to live like that amongst each other. But here's the difficulty. Dominance is so powerful. Dominant ideology is so powerful. It is so deep inside of people's heads that people look upon then these intellectuals as weirdos. Where do you come from? Which planet are you from? And they're unable. They try really hard. So they set up these structures. They set up these clubs and these societies to try and teach this new idea. And this is where the new era fellowship comes out, because they have it in their almost obsessive preoccupation that it is their task to break this imperial dominance into a new era, into a new world, and to imagine that a new world is possible. And they try to live it, but they live it with such difficulty. People laugh at them. They laugh at them. They think that these are such strange people in their midst. How can they be taken seriously? And they come to be, and this is their failure, they come to be detached intellectuals. They have difficulty in taking this intellectual idea, translate it as they have into a political philosophy. They have difficulty in making this idea a popular idea. And so their movement doesn't become a popular movement. It becomes a movement of these extraordinary individuals that everybody understands that these are absolutely amazing people. They come to be understood as by people who are looking at them seriously as absolutely amazing people, but they're unable to change the social spaces in which they find themselves. And they ultimately fail. They fail. But the ideas are so critical, and I feel a kind of obligation to say to you that in trying to tell the story of who we are as a country and our liberation, we have in these people and the examples of these people models of what Michael was trying to talk to you about. So Michael was giving you those 3 cases. Here's a 4th. But it's not only a 4th in protest, but it's also a 4th, and this is our challenge here as intellectuals. It's a 4th in its deep understanding of how consciousness is developed, how consciousness is made, how consciousness must be changed. And so their preoccupation is to try and change the way in which people think, to try and shift us out of what this dominance is all about. They fail, but they've left in some ways this responsibility for all of us here to be thinking that what they were trying to explain to us remains absolutely, if you like, the top of our political tasks, our political agenda. That this in no ways is a rejection of our histories at all. It's an affirmation of our histories. When Ben Kiss wrote this thing about the contribution of the non-European peoples to world civilization, he was talking about how people everywhere around the world have been jointly responsible to bringing to this world these incredible things that we know about ourselves and that we have the benefit of. It's not only the gift of Europe from the 1600s onwards. This idea that Europe from the 1600s represents the climax of human civilization is the lie that we are being taught. Instead, what these intellectuals were trying to say to us, that the story is a story that reaches deep back into our past, and we ought to be pulling all of those elements into the story, into thinking about the full complexity of who we are as human beings. So I'll leave that with you, colleagues, and say to you that I'm very privileged to come to be here with you, and I hope that just a little bit of this incredible stuff has remained with you. Thank you. How do we eject this?
Mentally nourishing, eh? Yeah. I told you that you have a buffet. So we served you. Let me give you a dessert, and then we'll now get to engage these ideas. Dr. Kruger, can you respond to what Professor Kruger said?
I know it's getting late, so I'll keep it short. There was a quote that came to mind when by the way, I was one day, somebody from Guild newspaper, with some of Afrikaans paper called me and said, we have a book here, would you like to write a review on the book? I said, yes, sure, I'd like. So I read a few pages, and how privileged I was to be offered the book, but for them it was like a hen missing something special and accidentally cross on something because they didn't know what the book was about. Anyway, but when I read the book, there's another figure that perhaps became a little bit discredited lately, Langston Hare, but he said something that I think it's overused, it's an old cliche, but it's still profound. He said, the struggle of man against power is the struggle of memory against forgetting. So history can be written by friends or by enemies, winners or losers of wars, scholars and researchers, or it could be written as lived experiences. History could be descriptive, reflective, comparative, interpretive, or analytical. From a scholarly perspective, the biggest threat to our understanding of history is that it's never codified at all. Oral history has its own reality and romanticism, but the question is it ours? The question that comes to mind upon reading Crane-Sodin's Cape Radicals, how do we change the status quo? How do we change people's minds? How do you embed an institutional memory of resistance over generations? How complex should the societal architecture of liberation be to result in a constructive collective memory? How do we guard against forgetting? The New Era Fellowship reflects a mirror image of the UDF. Perhaps it was more of an intellectual exercise, a sociological exercise. Perhaps it wasn't only meant to liberate, it was meant to intellectualize, to inform, to embed a way of thinking. Maybe it was a little bit more, but there was a mirror image for me in the UDF and the New Era Fellowship. The complexity of ideas, the multiplicity of ideas, the urge to change not only the institutional arrangements, but also the connective tissue between individuals and ideas. Charles van Onselen, in his recently published book, Night Trains, reconstructs the role of commodified Mozambican labor in the process of industrialization of South Africa. Thousands of men who were transported in carriages meant for animals, trains, at night time to slave away in the dark, deep throats of the mining economy around the old Transvaal. They are mentioned in the text, but never discussed. They analyzed and contextualized. The lives of thousands of disposable workers remain commodified and uncodified. Van Onselen mentions that it is flabbergasting that it's mentioned, the night trains, but it's never considered in the context of the industrialization of South Africa and a massive commodification of labor. Historians, sociologists, philosophers all glance over history, building the puzzle of our past, using only the pieces that they recognize. Crane-Sodin, with his text, Cape Radicals, forced us to revisit the uncomfortable but necessary struggle of memory against forgetting. I appreciate the book. I thank you very much for writing it. It was a lovely read, and I encourage most people around me to do it.
Thank you, Sir.
Thank you.
All right. Ladies and gentlemen, here's an opportunity now to engage. We said this project, we even outlined there, we gave you the concept of what we are trying to do here with Mr. Motlou. We said this Hlegeta is a teaching and learning project. So we got mentally nourished. So let's engage. Let's try to see what has been planted in us, whether how we take it forward, how we engage it, did we understand it? You are also welcome to make inputs. So by show of hands, ladies and gentlemen, here's an opportunity. No, Sandiso?
Don't be shy, people.
Yeah.
Thank you very much.
Yeah. Well.
What Costa once said to us that sometimes while the meat was not given to children because it's half their yes. Today we got some really widely because it's half their yes. But I was trying to fast and some smile food that was these comments. In the issue of emancipation, I also try to include which is the same. By the way, I'm just a scholar of history. So through history, I've learned that, as one of my most powerful lecturers said, that the power of history lies within the person who people writes the history. So in terms of emancipation, the problem I have with it is that it leads to one losing their self-identity. When we come to the issue that if we look at historical events, those who were forced to be emancipated, they lost their self-identity. When you look at the issue of missionaries arriving in South Africa, cultures and ways of living were lost because of the insight, which is the Likaba from the Mandela, the insight of consciousness, in light of consciousness. So people end up losing their self-identity due to wanting to continue self-righteousness or to come and pose the identity that they are meeting the criteria which is needed by those who are coming and saying, you know what, the life we are living currently is not that one of being self-righteousness and so on. So let us emancipation and use our society. So we've seen that. In terms of the second presentation, I really want to thank the prof that, you know, Dr. Kongwa says that South Africans suffer from what we call the Hollywood system, whereby we think that just because one man went to prison, the whole struggle is summarized by that one man. If we were to ask one person to summarize the whole struggle of South Africa, we end up only agreeing that is Nelson Mandela. So today we got to know the real historiography of South Africa, that truly this is a struggle that has to be ongoing through history. So it comes back to what I said, that the power of history and knowing it and being conscientized lies to the person who writes it down. So, in conclusion, I just wanted to say, in the second we've seen, and this is a diagnosis I've made as a scholar. The problem with what we're doing today is the wrong diagnosis. As we begin today, we've learned that apartheid, rationalism, all these things, this big thing is a psychological thing that is put through education systems. But today we want to fight it economically. So we've diverted the war which started a psychological event. So we are misleading ourselves. We are trying to diagnose the cause of the problem, but we are directly fighting it. So hence I'm saying the real resolution is to go back to the bottoms. One of my friends once said to me, you know why I love white people? He says, white people don't have this idea of bending. And rather than bending, they go down and sit in bottoms and they discuss. So we must kill this mentality to think that everything is like radicalism. We must
Sure.
Also I want to get the issue of ideas. My friend Mr. Vibe was persecuted when he said that these ideas are actually misleading us because they were studied in Germany somewhere, and the person who was studying did not understand the notion that was happening to everyone. He studied the economy of Germany or whatsoever. But can we today have scholars who will now create systems or ideology that will serve the generation of today and the future generation? Let us be scholars, not copy and pasters.
Yeah. Sandys. Any hand? Another hand? Where is Amilcar Cabral? Where is he? Okay, now you may shoot.
Okay, I have a few points here for Mr. Neocosmos.
Professor Emeritus.
Yes. I'm very honored to meet you. In terms of your philosophical thoughts, the way you're thinking, I would like to compare you to a Mr. Karl Marx in the way he thinks. Because it's like you're writing in an era whereby people try to criticize the way you think. You state politics as a theory of identity right now. We live in an era whereby people, sort of like Americans, for example, they have this theory whereby they say they don't know where they come from. So you cannot understand yourself as a person if you don't know where you come from. The process is whereby you try to understand where you come from, you look into history, and then it goes back to identity, whereby we subdivide each other as I'm an African, I'm an European, I am an Asian. The division is the same division that we face right now with xenophobia, where people, if I see a fellow African, I see him as my enemy because he's a Zimbabwean and I'm a South African. It goes back to identity. Like in history, it's important. They always say, let me refer to my family. My mother always says, in order to understand where you are going, you need to understand where you come from. That's the concept that we learn as we grow up as children, African children, I'd like to say. So in terms of emancipation, does it mean that we need to neglect our African history? Does it mean that we need to neglect where we come from? I like the way you think because, like Mr. Krogramp just said right now, it's a philosophy whereby we need to change the way we think rather than the way we live. It's more of a theoretical aspect or way of thinking rather than a practical way of living, because we live in a society where identity is a thing. It would take, like Professor here said, it would take ages to deconstruct the way people think. Because if you come out right now, I see an old white man, that's an identity. How do I then change the way I think? Do I then all of a sudden say, he's a human, I'm a human? Or do I continue saying, he's an old white man and I'm a young black woman? How do we change that?
All right. Yeah. Basically, Neo says our history has been a history of deconstruction and reconstruction. Another hand? Neo? Mpo? Yes. Okay.
This is also for Dr. Cosmos. Yes, it is. I definitely understood the theoretical aspect of emancipation and the fact that human life is human life. That is the one thing that we should take into consideration above all, and the fact that in the way in which society is structured, we should strive to always put the human above anything else, right? So with regards to emancipation, we have to free ourselves and get to a point where we realize that everybody else is a human being above anything else. So above identity with regards to maybe ethnicity, religion, or any other typology, we're human. So now the question is, in a society where we are striving to be emancipated, how do we react to people who resist change? Because we know that when it comes to things like emancipation, there comes change. People are afraid of things such as losing control. There are people who are afraid that if I adopt a new ideology, then I might lose certain control because maybe I am already used to practicing something that is different. So how do we now react, or how do we try to move towards an era where we get people, or everyone rather, to be aligned within the same way of thinking? And how do we react to people who are resistant to that type of thinking? And then I just wanted to make a point to, I think, Sandiso, who said that riots or violent protests are an African thing. They are not an African thing. If you check all over Europe, countries like France, for example, they always have violent riots. In Chicago, in Hong Kong, for example, even recently, there were very, very violent protests. Violence does not come because of race. It's because of built-up anger that people have had for a long period of time, and it gets to a point where they explode, regardless of race. So if you live in a specific area and people have been neglecting your outcry for a long time, at some point you're going to have an outburst. It is not a race thing, it is a human thing. People are going to burst out at some point if they feel like they're not being heard. So now that also goes towards emancipation. We have to, Bob Marley said this, emancipate yourself from mental slavery, right? Whatever you, yes, only ourselves can free our minds. So now if we're going to talk about how our education system or how white people came and emancipated us, that was not emancipation. You cannot view being a slave as emancipation. Okay. You cannot view being forced into religion as emancipation. The process where you now detach yourself from what you have been taught over time is emancipation. You are now freeing yourself and you are decolonializing yourself from whatever it is that you have been taught over time. Alrighty. And then Prof also said here that it is something that takes generations. It is not an instant change. It is not something that happens overnight. So one thing that we do have to realize, one thing that I did obviously take away from him is, as much as we try to change, a revolution is something that is going to take a very long time. It is something that is very slow and progressive. So we have to get to a point where we are ready to work, number one, and put in effort and be patient. And not only be patient, but be willing to fight for whatever it is that you're looking for, but also be willing to wait for the result instead of waiting for something to happen overnight. I think that's what I got from both lectures.
All right. Thank you, Mpo. Dr. Leta there. Dr. Leta is the last, and then... Yeah, because, Prof, we have a challenge of the bus transport here. Yeah, so some people have to take the bus.
Hey, comrade, you must never call me Dr. But I always call you Prof and Prof. Let me start by first saying whiteness is trash. Let me start by boldly saying whiteness is trash. I'll say it again. Whiteness is trash. Is it the first time you hear these words? No. And I'm quoting from a UNISA professor that whiteness is trash. In order for you to better understand yourself, that is where your understanding must begin, that whiteness is trash. Because you were first defined as trash before they understood you as human beings. So therefore, whiteness is trash. Then understand yourself better as a human being. On that note, you brought us two white professors to speak about black issues. How do I, as a black person, look at a white professor talk about my blackness? And the question then is directed to the professors. How has your whiteness influenced what you are talking about? Liberals, historically speaking, have always been problematic. It's a debate that has happened within the ANC. Do we trust the liberals? A liberal sleeps in the suburbs during apartheid whilst a black man sleeps in the township. And then he drives a Benz while the black man is forced to take a bus. And then he comes back into the township and says, whiteness is trash. Yet you are enjoying the fruits of whiteness. You complain about whites having written your history, they still continue to write your history and you learn from them. Who is trash?
Can I go?
Yeah, no, you will respond. Okay,
can I go? My first question is directed to you, Professor Neo Cosmos. The question is, you mentioned in your presentation that there is an urgent need to decentralize liberalism because, according to Mr. Sisman, it has betrayed its own values and rather used as an alternative what you termed universality of humanity. So I'd like to know, like, futuristically, or rather on the level of theory, do you see that as a potential, ideology that, maybe future scholars can theorize on? And then to Professor, that question.
What do we see as a future Universal
The
humanism.
concept, yeah, the universality of humanity. Do you see that as a...
Universal humanism, do you see it as a future theory? Something
As an
we could
ideology, is it?
think further and develop. Yeah.
And then to Professor there, who made like the last presentation, I think I just want to challenge you there, especially with the tradition of scholars that you've also mentioned, who gave like a very rich intellectual tradition in terms of their research and writing. I think we also need to consider the fact that when they are pushing back against this idea of the identity, for example, you being you maybe colored and then someone being black and someone being white, if we are toppling that or that rejecting that whole identity, we are also rejecting an experience, right? We are rejecting an identity that has to do with a lot of things that we're still going through. For example, today, systematically, you can tell that even black people, they are still under a category of being oppressed, economically, politically, and otherwise. So, at what point are we going to be conscious of the fact of not rejecting the whole ideas of these categories or other identities, because we need to safeguard our experiences?
All right. Yeah, give Prof to respond.
Okay. Is this thing working?
It's for the recording.
It's not amplification.
It's for recording. It's fine.
It's for the video.
I can talk with it. Okay. It's actually very interesting to think about what whiteness is and what blackness is. I remember Fanon saying somewhere, it's the white man that created the black man. And in so doing, he created himself as white. In other words, before there were only humans, but then the white man comes and creates the difference, the distinction. What is whiteness? Whiteness is a politics. Whiteness is not the color of one's skin. There are a lot of blacks who are there are a lot of blacks who are black whites. And there are some black blacks. So or blackness cannot be reduced to color. What I mean when I say reduced. In other words, is a particular perspective on life, on politics. It's about racism, it's about colonialism. But not all racists and colonialists. And many blacks are. So we need to get that out of our system. But when we're talking about blackness and whiteness, it's not just simply, it's not about the color of people's skin. It's about how your politics are and what your politics are. Okay? So if we start from there, we might be able to try to understand. What I've tried to say is not that humanity all the time and therefore ignore where we come from. It would be absolutely absurd to say that. In fact, if we talk about human universality in a racist like South Africa, you're on the side of whites and on the side of racism because they are the dominant group. But what I try is that there is an African conception of universality. This is what the talk was about. I don't know if you got it, but it was about universality as a continent and as it emanates from our continent, and how the universality that emanates from this continent, this African universality, is in potential far superior, because this is not we are the dominant people and therefore only as a human, but it's one that says we are, and in that way it is fundamentally superior. It is a true, well, what you may call the white liberal universality is a false one. Liberals is not just simply my money. Liberalism is a whole perspective on politics which differentiates some people and says they are superior and has this stupid hypothesis, which I'm sure you've heard of. You know about the Hermetic hypothesis? Huh? Well, it's another class. They use the Bible to justify racial domination. And they do this Noah, when he was sleeping half naked on his bed, his son Ham comes in and sees him completely starkers. And as a result, the people resulted. And he curses the sons of Ham. And it turns out, of course, people say that the sons of Ham were black because he's very useful. So, let's return to this myth. Huh? So, all this is invention by people who want to construct these conceptions. Huh? And of course, you have to start by saying, I am black, I resist this, it's a load of bullshit. But you can't stop there. Because if you stop there, you could end up being fascist. Because you're actually saying, my ethnicity, my race, whatever it is, is superior to all the others. And it's on the basis of that ethnicity that we can all be freed. So it's not a matter of, it's a matter of saying, we are black, we are resisting domination. But we come to a point where we are saying, like the Gogos, like the African conception of universality, that there is something more. That there is something more than what divides us. There is also what unites us. It's not a program for saying you have to say this all the time, It's quite clear when you're an asshole that you resist that. And you resist by saying, my people have been dominated sent to slavery and have been dominated for years and generations and centuries and so on and so on. So no one is denying this. Well, I'm not. What I'm saying is that if we want to think and begin to think about human emancipation, we can't remain at the level of identity. I'm not saying we don't start from identity. That's the usual reaction, You start from when you are from your identity. But if you remain there, you end up saying, well, I have to get rid of those so-and-so in order for me to be us, uns, whoever it is, to survive. And you end up having war of one ethnicity against another ethnicity. And that is how the dominant powers are manipulating people. And that is what's happening from the powerful, So Herman Mashaba resigns as mayor of Johannesburg because apparently the DA is racist. But he's a xenophobic maniac. He hates foreigners. So in what way then, what moral basis does he have for attacking racism when he's also being racist? I mean, he's saying all these Mozambicans and Zimbabweans must get out of the country. So what's the difference? How can you take such politicians seriously? I don't think you can. So his anti-racism is skin deep. You turn it on when you need it, and the rest of the time you don't. So let's be clear, If we want, I don't want to take too much time because I think my colleague here has things to say. But so the point is, so we must never neglect where we come from. Never. But that doesn't mean to say that, you know, we are always going to look after our own and then everybody else be damned. You can't operate like that. Because otherwise you're just behaving like animals. There's no difference between, well, it is true. Because animals are about self-preservation. So if all you're doing is self-preservation, there's no real distinction between humans and the animal kingdom. There has to be something else. And that's what I'm trying to say to you. There has to be something else. And I think we need to look into our African cultures in order to find that something else. And not to listen to the Europeans who tell you what it is. Thank you.
Okay, wait, Sandis, let's listen.
So let me start exactly where Professor Neocosmos has ended, and say that an important conceptual and theoretical piece of this evening, I think, has been missed. And I'd like to say it's been missed, and I really would be very happy here, Frank, to come back and continue this fight around all of this, because it's absolutely crucial to me. And this fight is that when you say my history, my identity is in danger of being erased, the point that we are making to you is that the language that you are using to talk about what that identity is the language of dominance.
Yeah.
You need not be giving up anything about your past, anything. But why must you talk about it in racial terms? Right? So I need never give up anything from this rural place from which I can come and feel deeply attached to it. But why must I talk about it only in racial terms? I mean, why can't I talk about the beauty, the value of what my ancestors had brought to me in its full complexity? But when it becomes this racial thing, you have succumbed to dominance, because that's the language of dominance. Right? That is because you've come here, you've classified me. You've come here and said you've brought these two white men here. Okay? I'll say that to you. You've brought these two white men here. Now, no, you said, so I'm going to play with a major adjective, white. You've classified me.
Yes, I know.
Right? You've classified me. I refuse to be classified. If you'd like to be like that, that's your perfect and absolute choice. And I'm never going to take that away from you. Never. But I am not who you think you see here. So you've made a judgment about me, and I'm going to fight with you. You've looked at me and you've kind of worked out, oh, this man, how can he come and tell my story here? It's an extraordinary act of succumbing to dominance, let me say to you. It's trappedness. It's the language of what this process of oppression, subjugation is all about. And I was hoping that we could begin to think this evening about how you come out of that. And what Michael was beginning to say to you is we have in our stories here ways of retrieving a language for thinking about ourselves that is not the language of dominance. We have alternative words, terms, in ways of thinking about our humanness, which are so crucial, which we ought to be building on as using resources in thinking about how we are connected to one another in deep, deep, deep kinds of ways. So I don't want you to lose anything about your past. Nothing. I mean, one of the major issues that we have to be dealing with here is how these languages of our pasts are being erased by the minute. And they carry these deep, deep, deep messages and resonances of what our pasts are all about. And we're losing whole ways of understanding and responding to the complexity of the world through that. We're losing it. And we've got to try and find ways of holding on to that, Frank. So if you're going to think about a form of radical engagement with the complexity of the world here, the first thing that, as intellectuals, is what words are we going to be using to talk about the world in which we find ourselves, right? What words, what terms, what language, what frames, what ways of accounting for what we are. So I would concede and I would go along with saying that strategic blackness is essential for a moment in time. It's an essential response to racism, not to race, to racism.
Yeah.
You need to be fighting against racism, right? You need to be fighting against racism. And so the strategic ways in which racism has positioned black people, you need to fight against. And you must fight against it. But you've got to move beyond that. You've got to move beyond that, because if you simply use that as the vehicle for how you come to explain, account for, and look forward to the future in yourself, you're confirming dominance. You're reinscribing what that dominance is all about. So I'd much rather us think about the complexity of who we are and think about how, and I would go along with your saying that whiteness is trash. But whiteness is trash as an idea, not, I don't have anything against white skins. I do have something against whitened skins. You hear what I say? I don't want to look like Beyonce. Right. So it's really crucial that this white idea, this idea of whiteness, is challenged at its absolute depth in our heads. We need to challenge it for its political, its aesthetic, its psychological modes in which it has captured the world, the whole world. And it needs to be undone. And it needs to be undone in retrieving this complexity of who we are as human beings, and that we don't always face each other being classified. I don't stand in front of you wearing that apartheid classification which was given to me. I'm not white, by the way.
I'm South African, so I'm just...
I suppose that's the idea seeking. I suppose it's the sound of idea seeking. Okay, Sesmon is responding.
Ladies and gentlemen, I'm not responding. I'm saying, Professor Sudin, it seems like we missed the point, or the point has been missed. Let me not say we, because I'm not part of the we. It may seem that the point for this discussion has been missed, but it has not. And I want to say, I read your book, Professor Neocosmos. It's 670 something. And I read it cover to cover, if I should say. And because there are people who have not read the book, when we don't read, you said here, Prof, you chastise us for not reading. When we have not read the book, now, if you read the book, you'll see Professor speaks about feminism and the two approaches of feminism, the liberal and the traditional, where the liberal seeks to erase traditional practices, while the traditional seeks to retain the traditional practices, but to develop democracy from within. So it is not a matter of saying, cast away your background, your roots, and so forth, but to work around this excessive politics to transcend identity, transcend space, but to go towards this universal humanity. So, I want to say, Prof, we'll take you up on that claim of saying you want to come back, and you say, we'll bring you back one day. And when we bring you back, we will talk to deconstruct this element of whiteness. What Professor Neocosmos wrote in his book was also about uncivil society. So we want to poke further on the elements of uncivility within our societies or within communities. So within those, I think it's issues that determine and shape our politics in South Africa. So we will invite you again, but we'll talk and see how we do it, and our students will also give us feedback. So you have on your desk there, guys, feedback forms. Tell us how you review this session, what we should do further, how we should improve further, and Mr. Lekaba will explain about Tleketa, because this is a space of thinking. So we want to think further around these ideas, and it's not easy to think about them. So it's a start, but we're going somewhere. So, we'll give them, yeah? Okay, so, in conclusion here, because of time, we understand already there's a shortage of time. In my response, I had written us to think about emancipation. It's emancipation by whom, for whom, from whom. You see, so this is where issues of blackness and whiteness come, because it's emancipation, it's either by white or by black, from black or white, and so we still have a lot to think about, still a lot to reflect on. So we'll take some time to reflect on this, and then at a suitable moment we will invite you again. And there I think, I don't know, if we come there, guys, and we say, let's have 5 hours, don't complain, let's sit for 5 hours and deconstruct on these things. We have that stamina to talk for 5 hours. We should be leaving here at 1 a.m. actually.
In fact, I think historians will correct me, I'm not so much good in history. In the Middle Ages, the thought was constructed. Time was not a matter. Time did not matter. And I want to believe that tradition is a tradition that probably led to certain myths that came out of European civilization, let me call it that way. Because people could sit for hours and think, and disagree and agree, deconstruct and construct. With that said, ladies and gentlemen, I just want to quote Biko. He says, being black is not a matter of, but the attitude of the mind. Because if you are going to confuse Lekaba, that Lekaba is black, and you are going to follow him, you might be following a reactionary. That will lead you into a pit that you might not even come out of. You'll be surprised that the liberation movement was infiltrated not by whites but by blacks. So the myths that were constructed were not myths that were constructed over a century, a decade. Were myths that were constructed over centuries. And some of those thinkers, we call them fathers of sociology. George Hegel. We heard how racist Hegel was. He said there was nothing to come out of Africa. And in 1906, he said Africa is going to bring a new civilization that is more humane and spiritual. Anyway, it's fine. Let me say thank you very much, Professor Krensudin, for honoring us at your busy schedule. I know the Human Sciences Research Council is a very busy organization. I come from there, I know how busy it is. Thank you for honoring our appointment. Thank you when I gave you a call, you listened. Professor Neocosmos, I struggled to get you, Prof. And thank you, Prof was facing a bereavement. Prof faced a bereavement about 3 weeks ago. He lost his beautiful wife. And I struggled to get Prof because I know he's very accessible. And he's also very busy. You heard how he's now putting anthology of African thought, political thought from Egypt to current. And I was like, this is unlike Prof. Neocosmos. And when he responded, I understood. And thank you very much, Prof, for honoring our invitation. It means a lot for us. Because the ideas you put in this book are very good ideas that can challenge us to think. And we call this platform thinking. Seketa. This is where we must think. Viper, we think here. And I want to thank people of Center for Learning, Center for Teaching and Learning, because we struggled to put this thing together. We are living in a capitalist society. So to put things together lately, you need money. But at least you don't need money to think. So we had to get funding from CTL to put up this thing together and to even live stream with these beautiful cameras here and Tebogo there being here with us. It's an honor, Tebogo. Thank you very much. Let's clap for people in Center for Learning. And the leadership of the School of Government Studies. When we pitched these ideas of Seketa, it was accepted in the school and it has been launched today. Today is a launch. The next year, we're going to have a marathon of these seminars where you will be forced to think. We're going to turn around in this campus. We are going to be thinkers when we leave here. And I would like to thank Mutlo Unseisman. When I presented this idea, he was eager as well. And we always, like I said, in the morning when we meet in our corridor, we spend an hour thrashing out ideas. So we thought about this thing, and we thought, let's put it in a paper and let's properly conceptualize it, so that when you go and talk to the superiors, we talk with people with a very well thought concept. So we are going to roll it out, and thank you very much, Mutlu, for your backing. And our colleagues from law, history, public administration, they are not here. History, they are here. Charmaine, you had the role of women in history. I know you are very passionate about it. Yeah. And thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen, for your time. When we challenged you in our classes to say, come and listen to this, you dedicated these 3 hours. In the busy schedule, we are preparing for exams. So we don't take that thing for granted. So we want to say thank you very much. Let's remain with the spirit of engagement from here until we close. In December, let's continue that spirit of engagement. Let us deconstruct the myths in the townships, in the villages, in the suburbs. With that said, thank you very much and good evening.